Hi, well, thank you very much to everybody for having me today and for hosting this very interesting symposium and discussion. The focus of my remarks is really going to be on the Jewish vote, and for those of you who follow it, you probably are under the impression that it's a really important deciding factor in the 2012 elections, and that most of the public opinion, or most of the articles written about it, talk about Jews being hawkish, or at least Jews being very focused on Israel, and that the tension between Barack Obama and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a source of great consternation among Jewish voters, and that there's a problem that Obama and the Democrats have with Jewish voters. And I'm here to talk about this in terms of data, and really the conclusion that I come to when looking at all the data is that the only problem that Obama has with Jewish voters is that there's not more of them. Okay? And that the kind of conventional wisdom about what Jews think and what we see in data and polls and public opinion research is that there's a big gap between what conventional wisdom says that Jews think and what Jews actually think. And I'm going to get into that in a lot of detail right now. So I'd like to start with talking about putting this in perspective. The Jewish vote, historically, since exit polls began in 1972, Jewish vote has averaged about 70% for the Democratic candidate. The best day that a Republican had was in 1980 when Ronald Reagan got 39% of the vote against Jimmy Carter, who got 45%, and John Anderson got 14%. So if you carry that out into more recent times, you can see that there was a bit of a spike during the Clinton years, even with when Al Gore had Joe Lieberman on the ticket, an Orthodox Jew on the national ticket, the Democrats got 79% of the vote, which is kind of shows you where the ceiling is. In 04 and 08, Kerry got 74% and Obama got 74%. If we look at it, and then if you look at it in terms of 2010, just to really see where we are today, what you see is 2010 was the single worst election for a party since 1938. Okay, and in this horrible election for Democrats, the Jewish vote was 66%. Okay, still slightly below that historical average we've seen in the presidential contests. But when you compare it to other base Democratic groups, unmarried women, Hispanics, and voters under 30, you can see that it was stronger than these other groups. And when you compare it to other religious groups, it was much stronger. Catholics, 44% for the Democratic candidate for Congress, compared 38% for Protestants, and white evangelicals, not a surprise. That's a Republican-based group, was 19%. Compared to other and no religion, which tend to be very progressive constituencies, the Jewish vote was slightly behind that. But my point here is that even in this wave election for Republicans, the Jewish vote held rather strong for Democrats. Now, what people often talk about is, okay, well, it may be overwhelmingly Democratic, but it's going to really make a difference in Florida, where this hawkish Jewish population, where Republicans can flip a few votes, and that's going to be the difference in a really close election. Well, as you can see from here, these are the states that have higher Jewish populations than other states, as well as what the result was in the 2008 election. So the state with the most Jews is New Jersey. 7% of with the most highest percentage of Jews in the state is New Jersey. 7% of New Jersey is Jewish. It doesn't matter in terms of it's not a swing state, it's not going to be close. Even with 7%, a big flip in the Jewish vote isn't going to make much of a difference. You move to some of these other states on here, you see 4 of these other 5 states are actually pretty competitive states. Florida, obviously, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Ohio. But even in these states, the Jewish population is so small that it would take a massive shift in it to make any difference whatsoever. So, for example, we could do a little case study in Florida. In Florida, there were no exit polls that showed in 2008 what percentage of the vote Obama got and what percentage of the vote McCain got. The reason, because the sample size was so small that they couldn't produce a reliable number. So what I did here was I took the national vote, which was 74% for Obama, and transpose that to Florida, just for the sake of this case study. So and based on other surveys I've done, it's fair to say that the vote in Florida, the Jewish vote in Florida, is relatively reflective of the national Jewish vote. The idea that it's more hawkish or more Republican doesn't bear out in the data. In any case, if you look at this, so if you assume 74% of Florida Jews voted for Obama, that would mean, based on what the actual results were in the vote, that Obama won non-Jewish voters 50-49. Now, if you hold that constant, because all these articles are talking about, it's going to be the Jewish vote that flips it, and so and they're focused on that, if you hold the non-Jewish vote constant, it would require a flip of Obama getting 25% of the Jewish vote in Florida, and the Republican getting 74%. Okay, there's not a shred of evidence that there's any chance whatsoever of the Obama vote dropping 49 points from 74 to 25% with Jewish voters. In fact, there was a recent poll in Florida of Jewish voters by the American Jewish Committee, and I believe it was around 70%, maybe a little bit higher for Jews at this point in the election. So I actually think that we won't get 74% of the vote because we're not going to get the same result that we got in 08 nationally. And when you see nationally, it's going to move down a little bit. It's going to move down a little bit in all the constituencies. I think it'll probably drop a little bit, and you'll see actually that in a couple of slides. But the point being that even some slippage will have we're talking about such a small portion of the population that won't have any real consequence in the overall vote, and in this idea that it could flip Florida is a little bit of a stretch. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through this one. This is just the party identification, which I'll start to get and explain a little bit more in the political dynamics, but you can see that the percentage of Jews identify as Democrats is relatively stable. In 2007, 66% of Democrats said that 66% of Jews said that they were Democrats. This is according to Pew Research Center. In 2011, that number was 65. Okay, it's been relatively stable. You see in 2008, it bumped up to 72%. The reason for that was the wave election that we saw in 2008. 2008 was a very historical election. It was the biggest vote for a Democrat since Kennedy. So in terms of the 53% that Obama got, it then dropped back down to its historical norm to 66% in 2009. You see the Republican number has been relatively stable with a bit of a bump up to 29%. 29% of Jews identifying as Republicans. Now, where does the election stand today? This is Gallup data. Back in June, it was 64-29 Obama to Romney. In July, it moved to 68-25. There's an unreleased Gallup poll that's been cited by some of the Jewish outlets that says it's now 70-25. The bigger point here is that you see a slight progression towards Obama as the election approaches. This is very typical of base constituencies in votes. Right now, as you get closer to the election, the undecideds or the weak voters for the other party tend to come back home towards the base, so to the base party. So in this case, Jews are base Democratic constituency. The number over time increases toward the Democratic candidate as the election approaches. Similarly, evangelicals over time will become more Republican in the polls as the election approaches. Again, this puts us right around the 70% figure that's the historical norm for the Jewish vote in the presidential election, and it's hard to see it deviating, going massively more for Obama, massively more for Romney in this election, despite kind of the noise that we hear. Now, why? Why are Jews such a core Democratic constituency? It's based on a handful of factors. The first is shared values. I know the previous speaker spoke a lot about abortion. We'll get into that issue in particular in a minute. But overall, when you start and you look at ideology, Jews are disproportionately liberal. 43% of Jews describe themselves as liberal, according to Gallup, far more than the national average was about 19-20%, and far more than Catholics, Protestants, or even those who say that they're agnostic, atheist, or have no religion at all. Similarly, if, you look at, we'll start to look at some of the issues. When it comes to the Iraq War, there was no constituency that was more against the Iraq War, no religious constituency more against the Iraq War than American Jews. 77% of Jews, according to Gallup in February 2007, said that Jews felt that the war was a mistake. Again, you compare that to other religions, including no religion, and it's far and away the most anti-war constituency. There's other things. It wasn't just kind of these core ideological values and the foreign policy, but also domestic issues. And this is really what's important in the election, because this is where people focus their energy, including Jews. So on the domestic issues, these numbers are from the Public Religion Research Institute poll that came out in March of 2012. They're consistent with what we've seen in other polls. 93% of Jews believe abortion should be legal in most or all cases. Normally, this wouldn't be such a big issue, or I wouldn't make this point in a presidential election, but this election in particular, we've seen this issue and play out in a more central, more high-profile way than we have in the past. Other issues, you look at the one in the middle, support increasing the tax rate on Americans earning more than $1 million a year, or believe the economic system in this country unfairly favors the wealthy. Again, this is at the core of the Obama-Romney debate over what they're going to do. But it's not just the issues, it's not just the ideology, but there's another key aspect to the vote and what drives the Jewish vote. And it's actually the distaste towards conservative movement and Republicans. And that's important. And that's, again, speaks a little bit to why you see the Jewish vote come home as the election approaches, move from undecided and uncertain to much more democratic. This is a graph that shows favorability measures of different figures and political parties. And what you see is on the far side, on the left, you see 76% of Jews give Bill Clinton a favorable rating. That his star still shines brightly with not just with the American public, but also with American Jews. You see Barack Obama has a strong favorability. The Democratic Party, 59% favorable. But then you get to the Republicans and the conservative figures. Mitt Romney is a 67% unfavorable. You're not going to make big inroads with constituency when you have a 67% unfavorable rating. George W. Bush, who is, again, the kind of a darling of the Jewish media in terms of he's great for Israel. Jews like him. We had research that showed his approval rating with Jews was in the teens on the verge of the election back in 2008. Republican Party, 76% unfavorable. Tea Party, Glenn Beck is up there because of at the time of the survey there was a lot of coverage of Glenn Beck going to Israel and how supportive Glenn Beck was of Israel. So that brings me to the next issue, and that is, what is it exactly that Jews vote on? And they vote primarily, like most Americans, on the domestic issues and the economy. This is an election night survey we conducted of American Jews in 2010, and 62%, we said, what were the top two issues that you voted on in this election? 62% said the economy, which is actually the same as what the national electorate said. The difference between the national electorate in 2010 and the Jewish electorate was while they both focused on the economy, they had very different views of what needs to be done on the economy, and that the Jewish vote was continued to support Democrats' kind of vision and approach to the economy. Similarly, on health care, the second most important issue was health care at 31%. After that, everything drops off. And what's really important to notice here is that Israel comes in at 7%. So I suspect Israel is a very important issue for folks who come to a symposium like this. That's a very important issue for me. It's not a very important issue for Jewish voters. You need to pass a minimum threshold as a candidate of being supportive of Israel, and then people move on to make their decisions based on other issues. And you'll see in a minute as to how people view Israel and why it's easy for a candidate and why it's easy for Barack Obama to pass that threshold as he did in 2008 and as he is in 2012. But it's important to, I think this is kind of the single biggest data point in terms of understanding the gap between conventional wisdom and how people actually vote. I'm going to get to questions in just a second. I just want to highlight a couple of more points about Israel. And I'll just run through this exercise that we do very quickly in our polls, in which we ask a very easy question. We say, do you support or oppose the United States playing an active role in helping the parties to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict? Very easy question for somebody to say, I support. It's not challenging them. The purpose of this isn't to create an inflated number or anything like that. It's the first part of a three-part series. 83% say, yes, I support the U.S. playing an active role. Well, then we make the test a little harder. And we give half the sample, gets the question on the left. Well, would you support or oppose the U.S. playing an active role if it meant the U.S. publicly stating its disagreements with both the Israelis and the Arabs? Half the sample gets that. And publicly stating its disagreements with Israel for the other half of the sample. For those who hear with both the Israelis and the Arabs, it's 67% support. For those who hear only Israel, it's 44%. And so what that tells us is that Jewish voters are very eager, very ready for the U.S. to play an active role, even if it means publicly stating disagreements, but they don't like it and they aren't comfortable, at least only 44% are not comfortable when it comes to the feeling that Israel's being singled out. And it's a very important dynamic to understand when you're trying to understand the Jewish vote. One last slide that I'll show you, and that is we ask people, okay, would you support or oppose the U.S. playing an active role if it meant the U.S. putting forth a peace plan that proposes borders and security arrangements between Israelis and Palestinians, and 70% support that. So the idea that Obama has either has a strained relationship with Netanyahu or that he's been too aggressive with Netanyahu, it's certainly part of the media's coverage of the dynamics, but it does not translate into any impact whatsoever with Jewish voters. If anything, they don't want Israel to be singled out, but they do support Obama very strongly, and they do support the idea of the U.S. playing an active role. So I'll stop there and take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstein. Thank you very much. Okay, again, these are such important and interesting presentations. I wish we had more time. Can we take some quick questions from Mr. Gerstein? If not, as usual, I will be the first to ask. Yes, sir.
How you can coincide your numbers that the main issue for Jewish community is economy, which is 62%, and dislike of Tea Party. And Tea Party generally is a party that allocate main goal of economy, which is kind of the same but absolutely different attitude of Jewish community.
Well, I think it's very clear that while the Tea Party prioritizes the economy as one of their issues, among others like the Constitution and some other aspects, their priority, or the way they prioritize it, is very much at odds with the worldview of how Jews prioritize it and what Jews think should be done. Jews are very progressive on the issue. You saw the numbers about taxing those making over $1 million per year, increasing those taxes. A great example would be the Bush tax cuts. According to this data, Jews would be very supportive of letting those tax cuts expire, whereas for the Tea Party, that is not a place that they want to go. So it's a priority. They just have completely different worldviews, as we saw in in their self-ideology numbers, as we saw in how they view issues like the economy, as well as domestic issues like abortion.
Mitchell Hochberg, quickly.
The numbers in terms of money donated to each party and candidate all along the same line as that split, or is it disproportionate?
It's funny you should ask that. There's 3 more slides on that, but the time ran out. But I will say, I'll speak to it without mentioning the slides, or without bringing up the slides. We did ask, have you donated, have you already donated, or do you intend to, actually, let me take a step back. I'll be happy to. Yes, okay, so the first question we asked people is, in the 2008 presidential campaign, did you make a financial contribution to the campaign of Barack Obama or the campaign of John McCain? 81% said no, I didn't. These are Jewish voters. 16% said yes, I contributed to Obama's campaign. 4% I said I contributed to McCain's campaign. Then we asked them, okay, among those people who said they contributed, have you already, or do you intend to contribute again? And at the time, it was before Romney was the official candidate, so we just said to the Republican candidate for Obama. And what you see is 82% said they will give again to Obama, 80% to the Republican candidate, so that's virtually no difference. I would characterize that as a high level of enthusiasm among donors for both, among Democratic donors for Obama and among Republican donors for the Republican candidate. The difference is that there's about a 4-to-1 ratio in terms of where the giving goes. And that's not something we ask in a public opinion poll, because, and it's very difficult to assess. And this is actually one of the bones I would have to pick with all these articles saying, oh, funding is dropping. If the votes aren't dropping, well, the funding is. The FEC, where you would have to get this data, does not list religion as one of the things you need to report, which is a good thing, I think. But that they, so it's impossible to know. And you can go through and try and figure out who's got Jewish last names, this and that. But there's no, it's just not an accurate way to assess it, and it turns out to be anecdotal and leads to some anecdotal-driven stories. This at least tells us how much, whether people intend to give back, or give again, who and who they have given to in the past.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gerstein.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.